Trump just pulled off something nobody thought was possible. For months, Trump has been pressuring Mexico's government over their refusal to confront the cartels. He offered military assistance. He pushed for joint operations. He warned about what would happen if the cartels continued to strengthen. And Mexico's president said no every single time until the country erupted. Because what started as quiet frustration inside Mexico suddenly exploded into full-blown chaos. Major cities under siege, the national palace swarmed by angry citizens, security barriers ripped down, and chants accusing the government of protecting the very criminal networks terrorizing them. And right in the center of this storm, Trump's gamble, a blunt offer: give us the green light and we will solve the cartel problem for you. Mexico rejected him, but then the cartels made a fatal mistake, and that mistake changed everything. Today we're breaking down what Trump saw coming, why Mexico's government finally buckled under the pressure, how this seismic shift has already sent shockwaves across the hemisphere, and why this moment represents one of the biggest strategic wins of Trump's second term. And trust me, by the end of this video, you're going to see the larger picture that's been hiding in plain sight. To understand why Trump's gamble paid off so dramatically, we need to go back to the moment everything started unraveling inside Mexico. Picture this. It's a weekend in late 2025, and Mexico City, one of the largest, most vibrant capitals in the world, erupts. Not just protests, not just marches. We're talking full-blown riots, with thousands of citizens converging on the National Palace, the symbolic heart of Mexican power, demanding answers, demanding action, demanding that their president do something about the cartels that have been terrorizing their communities for years. Now, if you've been following the news at all, you know that Mexico has been dealing with cartel violence for decades. But this was different. This wasn't just anger at criminals. This was anger at the government itself. Citizens weren't just saying, "Stop the cartels." They were saying, "You're protecting them. You're the reason they're still here." Think about that for a second. Imagine if people in your own country and your own city truly believed, that the government was in league with the very gangs and criminals making their lives unsafe. That's not just distrust, that's a total breakdown of faith in leadership. And that's exactly what happened in Mexico. Protesters tore down metal barriers around the presidential palace. They pushed past security forces. Police officers, over 100 of them, were injured as crowds grew angrier and more desperate. Officers fell back into defensive formations, holding plastic shields as citizens chanted, "Carlos did not die. The government killed him." Who was Carlos? We'll get to that in just a moment, but first, let's talk about what Trump saw in all this chaos. Because while most people were watching the riots with shock and confusion, Trump had been warning about this exact scenario for months. He'd been saying, publicly and privately, that Mexico's refusal to confront the cartels was going to backfire. He'd been saying that corruption and fear had paralyzed the Mexican government. He'd been saying that unless something changed, the country would destabilize. And now, here it was destabilization in real time. So what triggered this explosion? What was the spark that finally set everything off? It was one shocking, brutal event that crystallized all the frustration and fear that had been building for years. The murder of Mayor Carlos Monzon. Carlos wasn't just any politician. He was young, charismatic, and hugely popular, especially among younger Mexicans who saw him as a voice for reform and accountability. He was also a vocal critic of both the cartels and the government's failure to confront them. And one day, in broad daylight, in front of witnesses, cartel forces murdered him. Let that sink in. A sitting mayor, gunned down publicly, as a message, as a warning, as a demonstration of power. Now, you might think that kind of violence would make people more afraid, more willing to stay quiet and keep their heads down. And, for a while, that's exactly what happened in Mexico. But Carlos's death had the opposite effect. It became the moment when fear turned into rage, when silence turned into shouting, when people stopped blaming just the cartels and started blaming the government for allowing it to happen. The chant we mentioned earlier, "The government killed him," spread like wildfire across social media, across protests, across the entire country. It wasn't literally true, of course. The cartels pulled the trigger. But in the minds of millions of Mexicans, it might as well have been the government, because President Claudia Sheinbaum had done nothing to stop it. She had refused outside help. She had downplayed the cartel threat. She had, in the eyes of her own people, chosen to protect her political image over protecting them. And that's when Trump's earlier gamble, the offer everyone had laughed at, suddenly didn't seem so crazy anymore. Let's rewind a bit. Months before the riots, before Carlos's assassination, Trump had reached out to Mexico's president with a straightforward proposal. He said, essentially, we know you're struggling with cartels. We know they're powerful, well-funded, and deeply embedded in your country. Let us help. Give us the green light, and we'll send in U.S. military support. We'll coordinate with your forces. We'll target cartel leadership, disrupt their supply chains, cut off their funding. We'll do what needs to be done to permanently weaken their grip on your country. Now, imagine being Mexico's president and hearing that. On one hand, it's a tempting offer. The cartels are a nightmare. They've killed tens of thousands of people. They've corrupted police, politicians, judges. They've made parts of the country effectively ungovernable. On the other hand, accepting military help means admitting you can't handle your own problems. It means opening your country to foreign troops. It means political embarrassment, potential backlash, and the risk that things could go wrong and make you look even worse. So what did President Sheinbaum do? She said no. Publicly and emphatically, she denied that Trump had even made the offer, dismissing reports as exaggerations or misunderstandings. But Trump doesn't let things go easily. He later confirmed, on the record, that yes, he absolutely made that offer, and yes, she absolutely rejected it. He was blunt about his reasoning, too. He talked about the over 250,000 American lives lost each year to drug overdoses, many of them from cartel-supplied substances. He talked about the millions of migrants who'd crossed into the United States, many of them transported or exploited by cartel-controlled smuggling networks. He framed the fight against the cartels not as interference in Mexico's sovereignty, but as a shared challenge affecting both nations. And he made it clear, if Mexico wanted help, the United States was ready, but if they didn't, well, the consequences would be on them. For a while, it seemed like Sheinbaum's gamble refusing Trump and trying to manage the cartel problem on her own terms might work. The status quo held, violence continued, but it wasn't boiling over. The public was frustrated, but not yet furious. Then Carlos was killed. Then the riots started, and then something else happened. Something that most people outside Mexico didn't notice at first, but that changed the entire political equation. Mexican officials started breaking ranks. One of the most striking moments came when Senator Lily Tellez went on television and said, plainly and without hesitation, Mexico is a narco state. She didn't sugarcoat it. She didn't hedge. She said that the ruling political party, Morena, had been financed by cartel money. She said that cartel influence reached deep into government institutions. She said that the cartels weren't just a security problem, they were the government's silent partners. And then she said something even more explosive. The Mexican people want U.S. support. The only ones who don't are the politicians who benefit from keeping the cartels strong. Now, that's not just criticism, that's accusation. That's a sitting senator calling her own government corrupt and complicit. And here's the thing, her words resonated. Protesters echoed them. Social media amplified them. Ordinary Mexicans, exhausted and terrified, started saying the same thing. We need help. We can't do this alone. And that created an opening, a political fracture, a crack in the wall that Trump had been quietly waiting for. Because while the riots were raging and senators were speaking out, something else was happening behind the scenes. The U.S. State Department, led by Marco Rubio, had been working quietly for months to build relationships with Mexican politicians, mayors, governors, and civic leaders who were willing to push back against Sheinbaum's policies. They weren't trying to orchestrate a coup or destabilize Mexico for its own sake. They were laying groundwork, building trust, positioning themselves so that when the moment came when public opinion shifted, they'd have allies in place who could push for what Trump had offered from the beginning: coordinated, bilateral action against the cartels. The goal was never to invade Mexico. The goal was to make it politically impossible for Scheinbaum to keep refusing help, to create enough internal pressure that she'd have no choice but to say yes. And while all this was unfolding in Mexico, Trump made another move that most analysts didn't connect at first, but that turned out to be absolutely critical. He started turning up the pressure on Venezuela. Now, you might be wondering, what does Venezuela have to do with Mexico and the cartels? On the surface, not much. But dig a little deeper, and you start to see the strategy. Venezuela's government, led by Nicolas Maduro, has been a regional problem for years. It's aligned with hostile powers like Russia, China, and Iran. It's been a hub for drug trafficking, money laundering, and organized crime. And it's been exporting instability, refugees, criminal networks, political chaos across Latin America. Trump, knowing all this, started hinting publicly at potential military action against Maduro's regime. He repositioned U.S. naval assets into the Caribbean. Aircraft carriers, destroyers, amphibious assault groups, serious hardware. Venezuela's government freaked out, claiming that U.S. airstrikes were imminent. Media outlets started speculating, and suddenly, the entire region was on edge. Now, was Trump really planning to invade Venezuela? Maybe, maybe not. But that wasn't the point. The point was to send a message: the United States is done sitting on the sidelines. We're done watching cartels, dictators, and corrupt governments destabilize our hemisphere. We're ready to act. And Mexico got that message loud and clear. Because suddenly, President Scheinbaum found herself in an impossible position. At home, her cities were in chaos. Her own senators were calling her government corrupt. Citizens were demanding change. And just across her northern border, the United States was demonstrating, not just with words, but with military hardware positioned throughout the region, that it was willing and able to reshape Latin America with or without her cooperation. So what did she do? She made a classic political miscalculation. Instead of addressing the actual crisis, instead of acknowledging the cartel problem or engaging with the protesters' legitimate grievances, she tried to deflect. She claimed that foreign actors were behind the protests. She suggested that outside governments, meaning obviously the United States, were stirring up trouble, manipulating Mexican citizens, trying to undermine her administration for political gain. Now, think about that strategy for a moment. When a leader blames outsiders for internal problems, what does that really communicate? It says, I don't believe your anger is real. I don't think you're capable of deciding for yourselves what's wrong. You're being manipulated. It's condescending. It's dismissive. And in Mexico's case, it backfired spectacularly. Because the protesters weren't abstract political pawns. They were real people who'd lost family members to cartel violence. They were business owners who'd been extorted. They were parents terrified to send their children to school. And when Scheinbaum told them their rage was manufactured by foreigners, they didn't calm down. They got angrier. Protests intensified. Her approval ratings collapsed. Political allies, who'd been quietly supporting her, started distancing themselves, sensing that her position was becoming politically toxic. And Trump, watching all this unfold, didn't need to say a word. The pressure was mounting on its own. But here's where things get really interesting. Because while Mexico was imploding politically, something else was happening in the United States that completely reshaped the economic and strategic landscape. Trump's immigration and deportation policies, which had been controversial and heavily criticized, started producing results that no one, not his critics, not even some of his supporters, had fully anticipated. We're talking about mass deportations on a scale that hadn't been seen in modern American history. Now, I know immigration is a sensitive topic. People have strong feelings on all sides. But let's set aside the politics for a moment and just look at the numbers and the economics. Because what happened over the course of Trump's second term was genuinely unprecedented. Over a 10-month period, more than 2 million people who'd entered the United States illegally, voluntarily left the country. They used apps and programs designed to facilitate orderly departures. They weren't forcibly removed, they chose to go. On top of that, another 600 to 700,000 individuals were detained and formally deported through immigration enforcement operations. Add those numbers together, and you're looking at close to 3 million people leaving the United States in less than a year. 3 million. That's roughly the population of Chicago, or the entire state of Iowa, gone. Now, what does that actually mean economically? Well, here's where it gets fascinating. Every single one of those individuals, while they were in the country, was consuming resources. They needed housing, whether renting apartments, staying in shelters, or occupying makeshift accommodations. They needed food, they needed transportation, they needed healthcare, education for their children, public services. None of that is a moral judgment. It's just a fact. If you add millions of people to any system over a short period without expanding the infrastructure to match, you create pressure, prices go up, housing becomes scarce, services get stretched thin. And when you reverse that process, when millions of people leave, you get the opposite effect. Housing markets loosen, rental prices stabilize or even drop in some areas. Food demand decreases slightly, which helps with costs. Public resources that had been strained suddenly have more capacity. Economists who'd been studying inflation during the previous administration started connecting the dots. They pointed out that one of the major drivers of inflation over the preceding few years hadn't just been government spending or supply chain issues. It had also been the sheer number of people entering the economy without a corresponding increase in housing, stock, goods, production, or infrastructure. Kevin Hassett, who served on Trump's Economic Council, explained it in pretty stark terms. He pointed out that under the previous administration, inflation had spiked to nearly 10% at its peak and averaged around 5% over 4 years. Mortgage rates had skyrocketed, doubling the typical monthly payment for families trying to buy homes. Grocery bills that used to run around $400 a month were suddenly over $500. Wages hadn't kept up. Purchasing power for average American families had dropped by several $1,000s over just a few years. But now, just 10 months into Trump's second term, something remarkable was happening. Inflation was cooling, energy prices were dropping, gasoline prices, which directly affect everything from shipping costs to food prices, were falling noticeably. And purchasing power, the real measure of how much your paycheck can actually buy, was starting to recover. Hassett estimated it had already increased by over $1,000 per household, with more gains expected as the year went on. Vice President J.D. Vance echoed this during interviews, emphasizing that young people in particular were feeling relief. Housing, which had been prohibitively expensive for young couples and families trying to get started, was becoming more accessible. Why? Because, as Vance explained, the country had been flooded with tens of millions of people over the previous administration who were competing for the same houses, the same apartments, the same resources that should have gone to American citizens. And the country hadn't been building enough new housing to keep up even before that surge. Now, Trump's administration was addressing both problems at once. They were deporting people who were in the country illegally, which reduced demand pressure, and they were cutting regulations and encouraging construction to make it easier to build new homes, new factories, new infrastructure. The combination was starting to work, and here's the thing Mexico noticed. Because those same cartel-controlled smuggling networks that had been moving people into the United States were now scrambling to adapt. Their business model was collapsing. The money they'd been making from human trafficking was drying up. And ordinary Mexicans, who'd been victimized by those networks, who'd watched their own communities emptied as people fled north, started asking a question. If Trump can fix this problem, why can't our own government? That question, more than anything else, shifted the political ground beneath Sheinbaum's feet. Because Trump's policies weren't just helping Americans, they were indirectly helping Mexicans too, by disrupting cartel revenue streams and reducing the incentives for dangerous migration. And that made Trump's original offer, the gamble everyone had mocked, look less like interference and more like the only realistic solution. Which brings us to the moment when Mexico finally blinked. It didn't happen all at once. There wasn't a dramatic press conference where Sheinbaum reversed course and invited US troops in. But behind the scenes, the signals started changing. Senators, mayors, governors, people with real power and real constituencies started privately reaching out to US officials. They started floating ideas, testing the waters, asking what cooperation might actually look like. Could it be joint operations rather than a full U.S. deployment? Could it be intelligence sharing and logistical support rather than boots on the ground? Could it be structured in a way that preserved Mexican sovereignty while still delivering results? The answer from the Trump administration was consistent: yes. We're flexible. We're not interested in occupying Mexico. We're interested in destroying the cartels. If you want to work with us, we'll meet you halfway. But the help has to be real, and the commitment has to be genuine. And slowly, steadily, the resistance crumbled, because the political cost of continuing to refuse help had become unbearable. Sheinbaum's approval ratings were in freefall. Protests hadn't stopped. The murder of Carlos Monzon had become a rallying cry that wouldn't go away. And Trump's economic and military maneuvers deporting millions, repositioning naval forces, applying pressure in Venezuela had demonstrated that the United States was deadly serious. So here's what Trump's gamble actually accomplished. He didn't invade Mexico. He didn't launch unilateral military strikes. He didn't need to. What he did was create a situation where the only politically viable path forward for Mexico was to accept the help he'd been offering all along. He turned Mexico's internal chaos, its public outrage, its fractured political leadership, into leverage. And he combined that with his own domestic policy successes, falling inflation, record deportations, economic stabilization, to show both Americans and Mexicans that his approach worked. Think about the bigger picture here. For decades, the cartels have been one of the most destabilizing forces in the Western Hemisphere. They've killed hundreds of thousands of people. They've corrupted governments. They've flooded American communities with deadly drugs. And every administration, American and Mexican alike, has essentially thrown up its hands and said, this is just the way it is. We can manage it, but we can't solve it. Trump looked at that situation and said, why not? Why can't we solve it? Why can't we use American military and intelligence capabilities, combined with Mexican local knowledge and political legitimacy, to actually break the cartel's power permanently? And when Mexico said no, he didn't give up. He waited. He applied pressure. He let Mexico's own internal dynamics do the work. And when the moment came when the cartels made their fatal mistake by killing Carlos, by provoking the riots, by overplaying their hand, Trump was ready. That's strategy. That's patience. That's understanding that sometimes the most effective move isn't the most dramatic one. It's setting the conditions so that your opponent has no good options left except the one you want them to choose. And now, as we head into the final stretch of 2025 and look toward 2026, the landscape has fundamentally shifted. Mexico is no longer categorically refusing U.S. assistance. Public opinion in Mexico overwhelmingly supports joint action against the cartels. Sheinbaum's political position is so weak that she can't afford to keep saying no. Senators and governors are openly calling for cooperation, and Trump has demonstrated, both domestically and internationally, that his policies produce results. What does that mean going forward? It means we're likely to see coordinated operations, intelligence sharing, logistical support, perhaps even joint task forces targeting cartel leadership and infrastructure. It means cartel financing, weapons supplies, and smuggling networks are going to come under unprecedented pressure. It means the Western Hemisphere is being realigned, with the United States taking a much more assertive role in shaping regional security. And it means Trump's critics, who mocked his offer to Mexico as naive or imperialistic, are going to have to reckon with the fact that it worked. Not because he forced Mexico into submission, but because he understood the dynamics better than anyone else. He saw that Mexico's government couldn't solve the cartel problem on its own. He saw that public pressure would eventually overwhelm political resistance. He saw that demonstrating strength through deportations, through economic results, through military positioning would make cooperation attractive rather than humiliating. That's the win. Not a military victory, not a photo op, but a strategic realignment that has the potential to reshape North American security for a generation. So if you've been following these events and you want to stay ahead of what comes next, especially now that Trump's gamble has flipped the entire situation, make sure you like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me whether you think Mexico will formally request U.S. assistance, or if you believe the government will keep resisting until the situation becomes completely unmanageable. Your voice helps guide these conversations, and it genuinely makes a difference. Thanks for watching.